Speaker Mike Johnson is about to completely confront Representative Ilhan Omar with a surprise witness that leaves the entire hearing room in stunned silence. In a high-stakes congressional showdown, Speaker Mike Johnson sits face-to-face with Representative Ilhan Omar, ready to confront her with her own words, a surprise witness, and a faded photograph that could redefine her career. Some people did something was the exact, infamous phrasing Representative Ilhan Omar had chosen to describe the catastrophic events of September 11th during a speech at a banquet in California back in March of 2019. Just 26 minutes before this hearing began, the son of one of those tragic victims had walked right into the room, wearing a black t-shirt emblazoned across the front. In stark white letters were her exact words positioned carefully underneath that quote was a name Robert Frank Harros, and the date September 11, 2001. Sitting directly across the witness table, Speaker Mike Johnson of Louisiana watched her intently over the top of his yellow legal pad. When he finally broke the silence, his voice carried the undeniable weight of a seasoned constitutional lawyer, a man who had spent 20 years meticulously arguing in front of judges and mastering every detail of the brief. He stated plainly that he was going to ask the Congresswoman just one question regarding one specific phrase about one defining day in American history. This opening volley set the stage for a tense 3-minute exchange where a speaker from Shreveport, Louisiana would systematically press America's most polarizing congresswoman to justify those 4 dismissive words to a grieving son, whose father perished in the South Tower at 9/17 inches, the morning. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must rewind 26 minutes to the start of the hearing. "You don't speak for my country," Ilhan Omar boldly declared just 4 minutes into her opening remarks. She was dressed sharply in a navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, her hijab elegantly secured by a small silver pin crafted in the shape of the state of Minnesota. The bright C-SPAN studio lights caught the glint of that pin from 12 feet away. This highly anticipated joint committee hearing, officially titled Foreign Influence in U.S. Federal Programs and Member Conduct, had been locked onto the schedule for 6 long weeks. Omar attended as an invited guest and former member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Having confidently reviewed the witness list during her flight from Minneapolis the previous night, she felt secure there were no names on that roster that caused her any alarm. Looking at the Speaker of the House, who sat quietly at the lower bench with nothing more than a yellow legal pad, she assumed he was entirely unprepared. She pressed on with her critique, offering a backhanded show of respect for his high office before launching a blistering attack. She expressed deep concern that the individual now occupying the prestigious chair, once held by Tip O'Neill Henry Clay, Jan Rayburn, was a man who had dedicated 2 decades of his legal career to opposing women's rights over their own bodies, fighting against full citizenship for gay Americans, and demanding that immigrants like herself prove their loyalty before being granted the basic dignity of being heard. The Democratic side of the committee reacted with subtle approval as a staffer in the second row offered a discreet thumbs up. Unfazed and emboldened, Omar continued her verbal assault. She accused the speaker of orchestrating a hearing about so-called foreign influence, while acting under the actual influence of evangelical donors and Christian nationalists. She claimed these backers aimed to transform the nation into a theocracy, reminding him that these were the exact same individuals who in 2017 urged him to label her Islamic faith a dangerous religion. She concluded by forcefully repeating that the speaker spoke for their country, not hers, before leaning back in her chair. What Omar did not realize, and what nobody else in that room knew, was that the man she had just insulted had spent the entire previous evening at his Capitol desk with a single staff member. He had meticulously prepared using 3 printed pages from the House Oversight Committee record a thick manila folder of Federal Election Commission filings that he hadn't even needed to open, and a small leather-bound book tucked into his coat pocket. He had condensed all of this vital information into a concise sequence of handwritten pencil notes spanning just 2 pages on his 8½ by 11 legal pad. That very pad now rested squarely on the lower bench in front of him. 5. 4-year-old Speaker Mike Johnson offered no immediate reaction. He did not lift his pen, adjust his glasses, or reposition his microphone. Instead, he smoothly placed his blue Bic ballpoint pen onto the pad in one fluid motion, letting it roll an inch before it came to a complete halt. 16 seconds ticked by in total silence. Slowly, he opened the legal pad to his first page of handwritten notes, retrieved his reading glasses from the bench, and put them on without bothering to clean them. Turning the microphone toward himself, his voice emerged quiet and perfectly controlled. He embodied the exact demeanor of a constitutional lawyer, preparing to guide an unsuspecting witness through a devastating legal brief. With measured respect, he clarified his position to the room. He stated unequivocally that he was not there as the author of the 2015 Marriage and Conscience Act, nor as a subcommittee chairman, nor as a Southern Baptist. He was there solely as the duly elected Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. He framed the constitutional question for the committee and the 4 million viewers watching at home. Keeping his eyes locked firmly on his legal pad, he listed a stunning series of allegations questioning whether a sitting member of Congress who had lied to a federal court, lied to the IRS, and lied to a national television audience about the destination of millions in donor funds should remain in office. He further questioned the fitness of a member who made dismissive remarks about September 11th in front of a Muslim audience in California, and who maintained a top-secret security clearance on the Foreign Affairs Committee for 4 years, while her home state channeled tens of millions of dollars to a designated extremist organization. Finally, locking eyes with Omar, he declared that the true constitutional issue was not about who spoke for the country, but whether she had ever in her entire career told the truth about anything that truly mattered. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the hearing room. Johnson then shifted the focus directly to her earlier comments about his faith, announcing he would read from a document she had submitted under penalty of perjury to the state of Minnesota. The studio light caught his reading glasses as he referenced a man named Ahmed. Reading from the small, tight deposition-style handwriting on his first page, he meticulously laid out the legal facts. He detailed how, in 2017, she signed a sworn divorce application under Minnesota law. He emphasized the magnitude of that document, stating she had written under penalty of perjury that she had not been in contact with Mr. Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi since June of 2011. He paused to let the weight of that claim settle. 6 full years of zero contact, sworn under oath to a state court. Deliberately, Johnson rotated his legal pad 90 degrees on the bench. Clipped neatly to the upper left corner of the second page was a slightly faded 8x10 photograph held in place by a single paper clip. He explained to the silent room that this was an Instagram picture from June 2015, posted from her own account using the handle Hammy and location tagged in London. As he held the page up, the robotic C-SPAN cameras immediately found the photograph. The producer in the broadcast truck zoomed in, allowing 12 million American households to watch the image fill their living room screens. The picture clearly showed a smiling young woman in a hijab, standing comfortably next to a young man in a button-down shirt. The young woman's hand was resting casually on the young man's shoulder. The speaker explicitly identified the man as Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi, pointing out the glaring contradiction that the photo was dated 4 years after she swore to a Minnesota court that she hadn't laid eyes on him. Setting the page down, Johnson leveraged his 2 decades of legal experience to translate this severe discrepancy into plain English for the public. Keeping his eyes locked on Omar, he explained that she had signed a binding court document claiming 6 years of separation, yet she traveled to London, took a cozy photograph with him, and posted it online. He suggested she either forgot or assumed no one would check, failing to realize that the internet preserves photographic evidence forever. He then escalated the timeline to 2019, when she took her oath for the United States Congress and was subsequently appointed to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He highlighted that securing her top-secret clearance required an extensive FBI background check, during which she entirely failed to mention the perjury or the damning London photograph. The speaker made the stakes crystal clear: the Federal Bureau of Investigation does not allow individuals to lie on a background check without severe consequences. He presented her with a stark binary reality: either the FBI miraculously failed to discover in 2019 what conservative bloggers had already published globally in 2016, or she had directly lied to the FBI as well. he noted grimly that there is rarely a third option. Backstage in the wings, Omar's communications director, a young woman named Imani Hassan, who had been with her since 2019, completely froze. Realizing the catastrophic gravity of the unfolding situation, she lowered her phone, abandoning whatever message she had been urgently drafting. When Omar finally responded, she utilized the highly polished defensive tone she had perfected for cable news appearances. She attempted to dismiss the allegations regarding her marriage as baseless claims that had been endlessly litigated by conservative media. She firmly denied that Mr. Elmi was her brother and confidently declared the case closed, citing a complete lack of criminal action from the state of Minnesota. Johnson, immovable and quiet, countered her narrative instantly. He clarified that the lack of criminal action was simply because the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board had already concluded she had filed joint federal tax returns in 2014 and 2015 with a man named Ahmed Hirsi, while she was still legally married to Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi. He quoted the board directly, adding that they also caught her improperly misusing campaign funds for personal travel to Estonia, resulting in an official order to repay over $3,000 alongside a fine. He emphasized that a guilty finding by her own state's agency, run entirely by Democratic appointees in a state Donald Trump had never won, meant the issue was far from closed. Omar's right hand drifted upwards to adjust her hijab, a minor nervous tell captured instantly by the surrounding cameras. Johnson pressed further, clarifying that he wasn't asking for a DNA expert to prove Elmi was her brother, as he hadn't seen the records. Instead, he highlighted her decade-long refusal to provide those very records to the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, noting that her father and sisters had also actively declined to be interviewed. He pointed out that the exonerating documents existed somewhere in her possession, yet she had kept them hidden for 10 years. He questioned aloud why any innocent person would withhold documents that could easily prove their innocence to a hometown newspaper, a state agency, a federal committee, and the American people for a full decade. When Omar offered absolutely no response, the speaker methodically turned to the next page of his legal pad. The handwriting remained the same small, tight pencil script, though he did not read from it immediately. Lowering his voice by a register, making it quieter but infinitely more intense, he addressed her earlier accusation regarding Christian nationalism and bigotry. He stated unequivocally that the country did not ask her to be Black Muslim or a refugee, and that none of those identities were in question. What the country demanded was the simple truth about the man in that London photograph, a truth she had refused to provide for 10 years. He drew a razor-sharp line between facing genuine bigotry and facing the legitimate consequences of one's own deceptive actions. In the silent hearing room, he affirmed the public's absolute right to demand answers one more time out loud, with the photographic evidence displayed clearly for all the cameras to see. Flipping the legal pad to the third page, Johnson revealed an even deeper layer of alleged deception. He asserted that the London photograph was not in fact her greatest betrayal. The true victim of her worst offense, he announced, was sitting just over her left shoulder in the second row of the hearing room at that very moment. While the cameras held steady on Omar waiting for their cue, Johnson invoked a highly specific and damaging time frame, 843 days. This was the exact duration between August of 2019, when Tim Mynette's wife filed for divorce, claiming her husband was in love with Representative Omar, and November of 2020, when Omar's campaign finally terminated its lucrative contract with Mynette's consulting firm. During those 843 days, Johnson's quiet voice revealed her campaign funneled $2.78 million to the E Street Group. He painted a vivid, damning picture of small working-class donors who believed they were fighting the corrupt cancer of money in politics, inadvertently financing the business of Omar's alleged romantic partner. The speaker emphasized the sheer audacity of paying millions to her boyfriend's firm, while both parties were still married to other people, and actively lying to the press about the affair's existence. Turning to page 4, which featured hand-copied text from a court filing, Johnson read the sworn words of Dr. Beth Mynette. He established her credibility as a doctor and the medical director of the District of Columbia Department of Corrections. According to the August 28 divorce papers, sworn under penalty of perjury, her husband had confessed to their 1 year old son that he was leaving the family because he had developed profound feelings for another woman, specifically Representative Ilhan Omar. Without looking up from his notes, Johnson subtly turned toward the back of the room, acknowledging to the audience that Dr. Beth Minette had driven up from Washington that morning without an RSVP. She didn't want to testify, she merely wanted to be present in the room when this specific question was finally asked. The broadcast cameras finally swiveled, finding Beth Minette sitting stoically in her black blazer and white blouse, her hands folded tightly and motionlessly in her lap, completely dry. Beside her sat a teenage boy in a blue button-down shirt and khakis, looking down at the floor. He had been logged into the Capitol by his mother at 6:53 that morning, under the name Noah Minette. Omar's gaze locked onto Beth Minette and refused to return to the speaker. Johnson relentlessly summarized the devastating betrayal. While a doctor was filing for divorce and in one year, old boy was learning his father was leaving for a woman named Ilhan Omar's campaign, comfortably wrote 146 checks, totaling nearly $3 million to her boyfriend's firm. He lamented that the teachers, nurses, and first responders she constantly claimed to fight for were unwittingly bankrolling her personal affair, while the man they were paying told his young son he was in love with the candidate. Pushed entirely to her breaking point, Representative Ilhan Omar pushed her chair back 2 inches, placed both hands firmly on her desk, and stood up. Channeling 8 years of finely tuned viral media instincts and the fiery energy of her squad press conferences, she unleashed a passionate, morally charged defense. She vehemently argued that the Federal Election Commission found absolutely no legal wrongdoing in the payments made to the E Street Group, insisting the firm provided legitimate services and that the FEC had officially closed the matter. Defending her complex personal life, she reminded the room of her historic status as the first black Muslim woman elected to the United States Congress, stating she had endured more scrutiny, harassment, and severe threats than any other member. She dismissed the decade of intense investigations by conservative outlets as having produced 0 criminal charges, 0 indictments, and 0 findings of fraud. Jabbing her fingers sharply into the desk, she condemned the relentless narrative against her as a racist and Islamophobic campaign, designed specifically to suggest that a Somali Muslim woman elected by working-class voters could not possibly be trusted. She accused Speaker Johnson of embodying the very bigotry that propelled her into office, claiming she represented the bright future of the nation, while he was merely a relic of its prejudiced past. She forcefully declared that she was not the one who needed to step down. Her defiant stand triggered immediate applause from the progressive press section. A media producer in the back of the room, whose company profited heavily from Omar-friendly content, stood up and clapped enthusiastically with his hands above his head while someone audibly cheered her on. 2 Democratic panel members nodded in agreement, and an MSNBC reporter mouthed in real time that she had just delivered the perfect soundbite. For 15 full seconds, Omar completely commanded the hearing room. Across the bench, Speaker Johnson did not flinch, interrupt, or gesture. His yellow legal pad sat squared in front of him, his pencil resting quietly across page 4. When the applause finally faded away, he spoke with exactly the same perfectly consistent volume. He zeroed in on her specific claim regarding 0 findings of fraud. He calmly reminded her that the Democratic-led Minnesota Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board had explicitly found she used campaign funds for personal expenses, which legally constitutes state-level fraud. Furthermore, filing joint tax returns with a man she wasn't married to amounted to federal tax fraud, a severe offense carrying a potential 3-year prison sentence per count. Acknowledging that the FEC found the vendor contracts technically legal, he argued that she had still committed a profound moral betrayal against her supporters. She had taken millions from small donors who believed in her anti-corruption message and handed it directly to her secret boyfriend's firm, destroying 2 marriages in the process. He concluded that those very donors were sitting at home right now, wondering if their hard-earned $25 contributions funded a legitimate political campaign or a romantic date. The room fell dead silent as Johnson turned his legal pad to the 5th page. The handwriting on this newly revealed page appeared lighter, as if written quickly in a moment of intense focus. Johnson addressed her proud assertion of being the first black Muslim woman elected to Congress, readily agreeing that it was a meaningful historic first that the country should celebrate. However, dropping his voice to a near whisper, he stated that the country should absolutely not be proud of the second thing that followed that milestone. He reiterated the devastating, undeniable reality. The trailblazing Congresswoman had leveraged her passionate donor base to enrich her boyfriend to the tune of $2.78 million. She did this while still married to another man, while her boyfriend was married to another woman, and while Dr. Beth Minette, sitting just rows away, was forced to explain to her one-year-old son why his father was abandoning their family. After a long, heavy pause, Johnson delivered a crushing, memorable blow. He stated she didn't just break the glass ceiling for Muslim women in Congress, she brutally broke the floor right underneath Dr. Minette's young son. He asserted the nation's fundamental right to recognize and remember that profound difference. The broadcast cameras lingered powerfully on Beth Minette, who was staring intensely at the back of Omar's head, her hands still frozen in her lap. Beside her, 17-year-old Noah Minette had lifted his head and was staring directly at the back of Omar's head as well. Turning finally to his sixth page, filled with slower, deeply pressed, and deliberate handwriting, the speaker transported the silent room back to March 23, 2019. He recounted her speech to a crowd of 500 at a California banquet hosted by the Council on American-Islamic Relations, noting the recording was widely available online for anyone to verify. Speaking slowly and quietly, he quoted her exact words regarding the post-9/11 creation of CARE, where she stated, "They recognize that some people did something leading to a loss of civil liberties." Looking up from his pad just once, he repeated that infamous, deeply painful phrase, "Some people did something." He condemned her choice of words to describe the horrific extremist attacks in front of a California audience just 6 months after taking her solemn congressional oath. In a final heartbreaking tribute, Speaker Johnson read out the true devastating toll of that day: 2,977 American lives lost, including 343 brave firefighters, 23 New York police officers, and 37 Port Authority officers. The rest, he reminded the utterly silent room, were everyday citizens, teachers, bond traders, janitors, window washers, and a man who simply went to work. Speaker Mike Johnson corners Representative Ilhan Omar with the devastating testimony of a grieving son, demanding she finally answer for 4 careless words and say one name out loud: Frank Harros. The tension in the hearing room was palpable as Speaker Johnson systematically dismantled the Congresswoman's infamous phrasing. He reminded her of the dedicated mail carrier who had faithfully navigated the 88th floor of the South Tower for 14 consecutive years, and of the expectant mother whose husband was anxiously waiting for her to return to their home in Brooklyn. They were not simply some people, he stated with unyielding firmness. They possessed names, faces, families, and funeral services. There were exactly 2,977 of them, and the extremists who took their lives, the individuals she so casually described as those who did something, had names as well. The perpetrators explicitly had a name for their horrific actions, and they proudly called it a radical ideology. Furthermore, they explicitly named the nation they intended to completely destroy, and they named it America. They were not merely random people doing ambiguous things, they were 19 named hijackers executing a named operation against a named target on a highly specific named date. They successfully committed the largest and most devastating mass tragedy on American soil in the nation's history. Yet the speaker pointed out the Congresswoman had chosen to describe this catastrophic event using the trivial, dismissive language one might normally reserve for a misplaced umbrella. A profound, suffocating silence fell over the hearing room. In the third row, a seasoned reporter from The Atlantic completely abandoned any pretense of taking notes. He simply sat completely, still entirely captivated by the unfolding confrontation. Johnson's voice remained perfectly steady as he noted that the people left behind by those 2,977 lost Americans, the grieving spouses, the traumatized children, the grandchildren, were still very much alive. Many of them still carried a deep burning anger, and some had been waiting 6 long years for anyone on a federal microphone to finally ask her to justify those 4 deeply offensive words. Turning his body slightly toward the back of the room, the speaker announced that one of those waiting family members was present today. He specified that the man was sitting in the 3rd row from the back, positioned on the audience left aisle. This man had driven all the way up from Wall Township, New Jersey, early that morning. He had arrived at the Capitol at exactly 6:15, entirely unannounced to the Capitol Police, carrying a precious photograph of his father. He had also brought a very specific T-shirt. The broadcast cameras immediately pivoted. In the 3rd row, from the back on the left side, a man slowly stood up. He was a 8-year-old construction supervisor distinguished by graying hair at his temples, and he was wearing a stark black T-shirt. The crisp white letters printed across the front of the shirt spelled out in bold block capitals. Some people did something by Ilhan Omar, March 23, 19. Directly beneath that infamous quote, printed in slightly smaller letters, was a name, Robert Frank Harrows. Below the name was the tragic date, September 11, 2001. In his hands he held an 8x10 photograph. The chairman of the Joint Committee, a Republican representative from Texas, who had only been made aware of this surprise guest at 6:21 that morning, gave a solemn nod and formally recognized Mr. Harrows. As the man walked purposefully toward the witness microphone, a wave of recognition washed over the press section. A reporter sitting in the 2nd row audibly whispered an expletive in sheer shock. 3 Democratic House members on the panel who had previously served on the Foreign Affairs Committee back in 2019 recognized him instantly as well. Notably, not a single one of them dared to meet his eyes. "My name is Nicholas Harrows, Jr.," he began, his voice carrying the weight of a 4-year sorrow. "I'm 58 years old. I'm a construction supervisor. I live in Wall Township, New Jersey. My father was Frank Harrows. He worked in maintenance at the World Trade Center." Nicholas detailed that his father had been a dedicated employee there for 26 years, was 62 years old, and was merely 3 years away from a well-deserved retirement when the hijacked passenger jet slammed into the South Tower at 9:03 the morning on September 11. He paused, letting the timeline sink in before continuing. He recounted the agonizing final moments, explaining that his father had called his mother at 9:07, just 4 minutes after the devastating impact. Frank had told his wife he was trapped on the 82nd floor, that the smoke was incredibly thick and toxic, but they were bravely attempting to use the stairs to escape. In that final desperate call, he made sure to tell his wife he loved her, and he explicitly asked her to tell his son, who was 28 at the time, that he was incredibly proud of him. The phone line went completely dead at 9:14. The massive South Tower completely collapsed at 9:59. It wasn't until March of 2002 that his father's broken body was officially identified using dental records. Nicholas then slowly lifted the 8x10 photograph for the room to see. It captured a smiling man in his early 60s, attending a joyous wedding celebration. The photograph was old enough that its vibrant colors had noticeably begun to fade around the edges. Nicholas explained that the picture was taken at his own wedding in June of 2000, exactly 15 months before the extremists took his father. He pointed out his father standing proudly next to his new wife. He shared a touching detail before the wedding. His wife had asked Frank if he would do her the honor of walking her down the aisle, as her own father had tragically passed away when she was only 7 years old. Frank had happily agreed, and he had cried tears of profound joy that day. Nicholas noted he still cherished the video of his father weeping gently. He placed the precious photograph down on the witness table, making sure it was facing upwards. Locking his gaze directly on the Congresswoman, his voice remained remarkably steady. He reminded her that in 2019, she stood before a banquet audience in California and chose to describe the horrific actions those 19 men took against his father as merely "some people did something." He demanded that she truly comprehend the gravity of what she had said. She had casually labeled the 19 extremists who vaporized his father with a massive passenger jet as just some people. She had reduced the brutal, premeditated loss of his father's innocent co-workers, his mother's beloved husband, his children's doting grandfather, and 976 other innocent Americans to just something. Nicholas paused again, ensuring every word landed with maximum impact. "My father had a name, Congresswoman," he declared. He reiterated that the attackers had names, and the horrific act of terror had a specific name. It was not an ambiguous something, and his father was absolutely not some people. His name was Frank Harros, a man who worked tirelessly in maintenance for 26 years, a man who cried beautiful tears at his son's wedding, and a man who died trapped on the 82nd floor of the burning South Tower while his helpless wife listened to him say his final goodbyes over the phone. Picking the photograph back up, Nicholas held it extended out toward Omar. He stated with absolute clarity that his sole purpose for coming to the Capitol that day was to force the country to hear his father's name spoken out loud on a federal microphone right in front of her face. He wanted to ensure that the next time she felt the urge to casually dismiss his brutal death as something, she would be forced to remember that one of the innocent victims was a hard-working American who paid the mortgage on his childhood home by diligently waxing the floors of a towering building she had never even bothered to set foot in. He forcefully repeated his father's name, Frank Harros, and the exact time of his death, 9:59 inches the morning, in the South Tower of New York. Setting the photograph back down on the witness table, ensuring it was still facing up toward the watchful cameras, he turned and walked back to his seat without ever looking back at Omar. Speaker Johnson did not rush to speak immediately. Deliberately, he removed his reading glasses, folded them carefully, and placed them neatly on top of his yellow legal pad. Reaching deep into his coat pocket, he slowly extracted a small leather-bound book that fit perfectly in the palm of his hand. It was a pocket Bible, its cover visibly worn at the corners from years of use. He rested the Bible gently on top of the legal pad. Speaking directly to the Congresswoman, he admitted he had not initially planned to quote scripture during this serious hearing. He acknowledged the fair criticism he had received from colleagues in both political parties regarding his tendency to lead with his faith rather than the strict letter of the law. Because of this, he explained he had spent the entire morning leading exclusively with the law, detailing the undeniable perjury in her sworn divorce, filing the documented fraud in her federal tax returns, the massive $2.78 million in questionable campaign payments, and the 4 devastating words she used to describe September 11th. He paused, letting the weight of the morning's evidence hang in the air before stating that Mr. Harros had just delivered a profound testimony that could not be adequately addressed by legal statutes alone. Without even needing to open the worn Bible, he recited Proverbs 1:2:2:2 entirely from memory. The Lord detests lying lips, but he delights in those who tell the truth. Leaving the Bible untouched on the pad, he looked intensely at Omar. He clarified that he was not trying to force her to find his specific faith, acknowledging that her faith was entirely her own. Instead, he was simply demanding that she find the human decency to speak Mr. Harros' father's name. Frank Harros, he was a man. He had a name, Johnson stated, before delivering the ultimate command. Say his name. The massive hearing room fell completely silent. In the second row, one 7-year-old, Noah Minette refused to lower his head. His eyes remained locked fiercely on Omar. Without missing a beat, the speaker pivoted to the 8th page of his legal pad, the handwriting on it showing signs of having been folded and unfolded. He introduced a new catastrophic timeline, January 8, 2026. He read directly from the official committee record of an oversight hearing titled Oversight of Fraud and Misuse of Federal Funds in Minnesota Part 1. Dropping his voice to a quiet, faint drawl, he detailed a massive fraud network based entirely in her home state of Minnesota. According to sworn testimony by federal investigators, this was the absolute largest pandemic-era fraud in the entire history of the United States. He pointedly noted that the criminal operation was run by individuals who had arrived in Minnesota through the exact same refugee resettlement programs that had brought her and her family to America back in 1995. The sheer scale of the theft was staggering, exceeding $250 million. Federal funds explicitly designed to feed starving children during the COVID pandemic were stolen while actual American children went to bed hungry. Even worse, federal investigators testified under oath that this stolen money was systematically routed overseas directly into the hands of an armed militant group. Johnson meticulously outlined the terrifying resume of this Somalia-based extremist organization. They were responsible for claiming 224 innocent lives in a single Mogadishu truck blast in October 2017. They had taken 11 American citizens since 2010. and the United States State Department had officially designated them as an affiliated foreign extremist organization since 2008. He then methodically closed the trap. For 4 crucial years, from January 2019 to February 2023, she sat powerfully on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. She held a highly coveted top-secret security clearance. She received highly sensitive classified briefings concerning foreign extremist organizations, specifically including this militant group. The committee had discussed the volatile situation in Somalia in heavily classified sessions more than 30 times during her tenure. During those exact same 4 years, her own home district in Minneapolis was functioning as the undisputed epicenter of the largest federal fraud network in American history, funneling stolen children's food money directly to an extremist-affiliated group actively operating against the American intelligence community in the very country her father had once served as a colonel. His eyes locked onto hers with piercing intensity. He accused her of absolute silence. Despite holding a top-secret clearance possessing more classified intelligence about the militant group than any other sitting member of Congress, and representing a deeply affected Somali American district, she did absolutely nothing for 4 years. She never bothered to write a single op-ed. She never introduced a single piece of legislation, and she never delivered a single floor speech addressing the historic fraud happening in her own backyard that was actively funding extremists likely to harm Somali Americans. He presented her with an inescapable binary reality. Either she was fully aware of the extremist funding and chose to remain silent, or she somehow held a top-secret clearance for 4 years, while the FBI miraculously failed to brief her about the massive militant operation happening in her own neighborhood. He grimly noted that there is rarely a third option. Under immense pressure, Omar's right hand drifted upwards to adjust her hijab. She completed the nervous motion this time, bringing her hand back down to the table. Slipping into her familiar defensive posture, she claimed the allegations regarding the militant funding were completely unproven and were simply being weaponized by Republicans to unfairly stigmatize the Somali American community, cheap political gain. Johnson remained quiet but immovable. He swiftly corrected her, emphasizing that these facts were testified to under oath by career federal investigators, not partisan Republicans, but veteran FBI and Department of Justice officials who had faithfully served under both Democratic and Republican administrations. He made it clear that the flow of the stolen money was an established fact, not a partisan theory. The only remaining question, he stated forcefully, was what she, as a congresswoman, with top-secret clearance, representing that specific district, actually did with the vital intelligence she possessed when she acquired it. The entire country, he declared, was demanding an answer to that specific question today. Seeking permission from the chairman, Johnson invited 2 final observers to address the committee. The chairman immediately granted the request. In the audience, 2 distinct individuals rose to their feet. The first was an older gentleman, perhaps 67 or 68 years old, distinguished by a stark white beard and wearing a dark, respectful suit. He walked slowly to the witness microphone, carrying the heavy bearing of a man who had journeyed much farther in his difficult life than the short distance from the audience seating. Introducing himself as Muhammad Farah, he stated, he was a 6-7-year-old Sufi Muslim who had immigrated to the United States from Somalia in 1993. He explained that he ran a humble small grocery store on Lake Street in Minneapolis. He openly admitted that he had proudly voted for Representative Ocasio-Cortez's Progressive Squad in 2018 because he genuinely believed they would honestly and fiercely represent the Somali community's best interests. After a heavy pause, he revealed his personal tragedy. His precious 8-year-old grandson Yusuf was brutally taken by militants on October 14, 2017, while simply visiting the Lido Beach restaurant in Mogadishu with his mother. The massive truck blast claimed 224 lives that horrific day, and little Yusuf was the absolute youngest victim identified by name. His mother only miraculously survived because she had briefly stepped outside the restaurant to make a phone call to her sister. Muhammad then held up a photograph for the committee to see. It featured a bright, smiling small boy wearing a vibrant red t-shirt and holding a soccer ball. Unlike Frank Harris's old photo, this picture was newer. Its vibrant colors, not yet faded by the cruel passage of time. Mohammed explained that he had diligently read the May hearing transcripts back in January. He had absorbed the horrifying testimony detailing how money stolen right from his own city, from his own tight-knit community, was directly funding the very monsters who took his grandson. He revealed that he had spent 8 agonizing years desperately pleading with his elected representatives in Minnesota, specifically including Congresswoman Omar, demanding to know what actions were being taken. In all those years, he had never received a single response from her or her expansive office staff. He received no comforting phone call, no official letter, not even a brief email. Pausing once more, he clarified his intentions. He stated he was not there to demand an empty apology for the stolen money. He was there to demand an answer as to why, over the course of 8 long years, she could not find the basic human decency to pick up a telephone. Having delivered his crushing message, he sat down carefully, carrying the photograph of his grandson back to his seat. The second individual to approach the microphone was a woman in her early 50s, with brown hair and dressed in a professional black blazer. She walked with her hands tightly clasped nervously in front of her. She introduced herself as Sarah Goldstein, a 1-year-old registered Democrat who had loyally voted for Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris. She stated she lived in Yorktown Heights, New York. This specific geographical detail instantly caught the attention of the sharp press section and the whirring cameras, as Yorktown Heights in Westchester County was famously the very same town where progressive icon Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had been raised. Sarah shared the painful story of her daughter, Sarah Jr., who was an ambitious junior studying at Columbia University in April of 2024. Her daughter is proudly Jewish and displayed a traditional mezuzah on the door of her college dorm room. Sarah recounted how on the tense night of April 25th, Congresswoman Omar had visited the chaotic Columbia campus, walking directly through the highly publicized protest encampment. During a speech that was later proudly posted to Omar's official Instagram account, the Congresswoman was recorded explicitly referring to Jewish students who chose not to participate in the encampment as pro-atrocity. Sarah paused before delivering the devastating consequences of that rhetoric. Her daughter was not participating in any encampment. She was simply trying to study for her challenging final exams. However, the very next morning, her daughter woke to find the door to her dorm room viciously spray-painted with the hateful word "atrocity supporter." Smeared directly underneath that slur was a deeply offensive Star of David, with a violent slash drawn through it. Terrified, her daughter took her sacred mezuzah down that very morning and completely withdrew from Columbia University. Just 3 days later, she has never felt safe enough to return to the campus. Sarah looked directly at Omar and clarified that she did not blame the Congresswoman for physically painting the hateful slur on her daughter's door. Instead, she fiercely blamed her for weaponizing the specific word pro-atrocity that made the targeted vandalism completely inevitable. She condemned Omar for recklessly endangering a Jewish student who was merely studying in her own room, transforming her college campus into a place where she could no longer be safe. Having spoken her truth, Sarah sat back down. It was in this incredibly tense moment that Ilhan Omar's famous hijab adjustment began. Her right hand drifted upwards on pure instinct toward her temple. Her fingers actually made contact with the fabric, initiating a small, seemingly insignificant motion she had reliably performed at least 200 times throughout her highly publicized career on cable television. It was a well-known nervous tic, a familiar physical comfort in moments of intense stress. But this time the motion abruptly stopped. Her hand remained frozen at her temple, her fingers tightly clutching the dark fabric. She failed to complete the routine adjustment, and her hand did not return to the safety of the table. It just stayed there. 1 agonizing second ticked by then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 full seconds. Because of the frozen aborted movement, her hijab was now visibly askew, pulled completely off-center by perhaps a full centimeter. The robotic C-SPAN cameras ruthlessly zoomed in on her face. 12 million Americans sitting behind glowing screens watched in real time as a piece of dark fabric remained noticeably crooked on the head of a sitting United States Congresswoman, a woman who until just 90 seconds prior confidently adjusted it every 2 minutes for the first 43 minutes of the hearing. In a shocking display of paralysis, she did not even attempt to fix it. Her hand eventually drifted limply back down to the desk, but the hijab remained glaringly askew. In the second row, young Noah Minette continued to stare at her. His mother Beth Minette watched her as well. Muhammad Farah cast his eyes downward toward the floor, while Nicholas Harros Jr. kept his gaze firmly fixed on the smiling photograph of his late father resting on the table. Sarah Goldstein simply looked at Omar with quiet judgment. 9 incredibly long seconds passed before the speaker finally broke the silence. When his voice returned, it was pitched even lower than it had been all morning. He addressed the 4 million Americans actively watching the broadcast, stating his desire for them to fully comprehend exactly what had transpired in that room over the preceding 43 minutes. He summarized her devastating record. She had callously dismissed Frank Harros, a man who worked maintenance at the Trade Center for 26 years, as merely some people who did something. She had sat comfortably on the Foreign Affairs Committee for 4 years, while little 8-year-old Youssef was taken by an extremist group funded by money stolen directly from her own district. She had publicly labeled Sarah Goldstein's studying daughter as pro-atrocity, directly inciting the hateful vandalism of her dorm room the very next morning. He emphasized the profound hypocrisy of her actions, noting she had done all of this while occupying a seat of immense power in a chamber whose sole constitutional purpose is to faithfully represent the very people whose names she completely refused to even learn. Johnson clarified that her true offense was not simply a betrayal of the working class of Minneapolis, the Somali community, the Jewish community, or even the grieving families of September 11th. Her ultimate crime, he declared, was a fundamental betrayal of the truth itself. She had lied about her brother, lied about her boyfriend, lied about the massive sums of money, lied about the infamous 4 words, and lied by omission for 4 crucial years. He concluded his summation by declaring that today, the country was finally allowed to remember the profound difference between her constructed narrative and the devastating truth. The hearing room was absolutely silent. Moving with deliberate purpose, the speaker turned his yellow legal pad over to reveal the final page. Page 9 contained only a single word written boldly in the same familiar pencil, but much larger than any of the other notes, and forcefully underlined twice. That single word was Frank. Johnson did not produce any further pages of notes. He calmly stacked his reading glasses precisely on top of the legal pad. He then placed the small worn leather Bible carefully on top of the reading glasses and solemnly folded his hands together. He informed the Congresswoman that he had just one final question remaining concerning one specific name, and he demanded a simple yes or no answer. The entire hearing room completely froze. He read the haunting details one last time. Frank Harros, maintenance, 82nd floor South Tower, died, 9:59 a.m., September 11, 2001. Pausing for maximum effect, he finally asked, "Was Frank Harros some people, yes or no?" The agonizing countdown began. During the first excruciating second, Omar's left hand drifted aimlessly toward her water bottle, only to stop halfway and retreat nervously back to the table. The second, ticked by then the third. Desperate for support, she looked toward the wings for her communications director, Imani Hassan, but Imani was no longer looking back at her. The staffer was staring defeatedly down at her own hands. The 4th second passed, then the 5th. Omar shifted her gaze to the witness table, where Frank Harros' fading photograph still sat facing proudly upward, capturing a smiling man wearing the very suit he had joyously worn to his son's wedding. The 6th second, the 7th. She cast her eyes toward the back of the room only to find Muhammad Farah staring resolutely at the floor. By the 8th second, she looked toward the second row, where both Beth and Noah Minette met her gaze with unflinching intensity. At the 9th second, completely out of options, she finally looked down at her own trembling hands. The 10th second passed the 11th, the 12th. Finally, breaking the silence, she attempted a classic political deflection, arguing, "The framing of this question is fundamentally." Johnson immediately cut her off with brutal efficiency, repeating his demand, "Yes or no, Congresswoman." The 13th second passed, then the 14th. Representative Omar said absolutely nothing. The speaker offered a single definitive nod. He didn't bother to stand up, nor did he raise his voice. He left the Bible, the reading glasses, and the legal pad untouched on the bench, making no effort to gather his materials. Addressing the chairman, he officially yielded the remainder of his allotted time directly to Mr. Harros, Mr. Farah, and Mrs. Goldstein, noting grimly that they had been waiting for an answer to that simple question for significantly longer than 14 seconds. The chairman promptly banged his gavel, calling for a 3-0 minute recess. Omar stood up and began to gather her scattered papers. Her movements were entirely devoid of their usual brisk efficiency. She stacked them once, set them back down nervously, and then stacked them all over again. She meticulously avoided looking at Beth or Noah Minette. She refused to look at Nicholas Harros Jr., and she certainly did not look at the smiling photograph of his taken father resting on the witness table. As she walked stiffly toward the side door, she passed Mohammed Farah's row without even slightly turning her head, and the grieving grandfather offered her the exact same cold courtesy. She then walked past Sarah Goldstein, who was now quietly looking down at her own hands. Just as she reached the exit, she briefly paused and turned back the broadcast cameras, swiveling to follow her every move. Speaker Johnson was still calmly seated at the lower bench. His yellow legal pad reading glasses and small leather Bible remained perfectly stacked in front of him. He wasn't even looking at her. His eyes were fixed respectfully on Frank Harros' photograph across the room. Without looking up, he offered her one final message, assuring her that his door was open absolutely any time. He invited her to come find him whenever she was finally ready to bring Mr. Harros's father's name and say it out loud, promising they could talk then. She offered no response. She turned and walked out, the heavy wooden door closing securely behind her with the distinct dull thud of a door that no one wants to violently slam but no one cares to gently soften either. The cultural and political aftermath hit with the speed and force of a tidal wave, arriving in 3 distinct, overwhelming waves. By 1138 that morning Eastern Time, 3 highly specific hashtags completely dominated the top trending positions across every major American social media platform. Number Frank Harros claimed the number 1 spot. Number 1 Year-old son dominated number 2, and number 4, years held strong at number 3. The viral video clip capturing Nicholas Harros Jr. powerfully holding his father's photograph on the witness table rocketed past 47 million views well before sundown. Moved by the testimony, the 9/11 Memorial Museum quietly and swiftly added Frank Harros' photograph to its prestigious rotating digital display by the end of the day. Acting on a deeply emotional request his son made by phone right from the Capitol parking lot at 1147 that morning. When pressed for comment by the New York Post, Beth Minette offered a profoundly simple one-sentence statement regarding the ordeal. "My son is 17, he is allowed to grow up now." Her son Noah, when cornered by an eager reporter outside the Capitol building, simply stated, "I just wanted her to see me." In stark contrast, Ilhan Omar's communications director desperately released a sterile 1-2 sentence statement at 1:14 inches the afternoon. It was a masterpiece of political deflection, strategically deploying the word Islamophobic 4 separate times, manufactured 3 times, and right-wing distortion twice. Tellingly, the statement completely failed to mention Frank Harros, completely ignored Youssef Farah, entirely bypassed Sarah Goldstein's daughter, and conveniently omitted any reference to the infamous photograph taken in London. Meanwhile, the Anti-Defamation League issued a brief, powerful statement affirming that Mrs. Goldstein had finally voiced what they had been shouting for 7 years, expressing a sincere hope that the country had finally listened. The Council on American Islamic Relations, the very organization hosting the banquet where Omar originally uttered those 4 fateful words in 2019, pointedly declined to offer any comment whatsoever. The Auschwitz Memorial Museum also offered no response, having already completely exhausted all possible statements regarding Omar's rhetoric years prior in 2019. The Federal Election Commission predictably maintained their bureaucratic stance regarding the Tim Minette payments, repeating the exact same phrase they had used for 6 years: "The matter is closed." Interestingly, when the Office of Congressional Ethics was asked if they planned to finally revisit the glaring perjury allegations surrounding the Minnesota divorce filing, they offered a notably different, incredibly tense answer: no comment. By the time the sun finally set that historic day, 3 deeply personal, quiet moments had unfolded far away from the glaring lights of Washington. In Wall Township, New Jersey, Nicholas Harros Jr. drove his pickup truck slowly back to his home. The arduous drive took him exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes, during which he had to stop the truck twice to compose himself. He finally pulled into his driveway at 5:43 inches the evening. His supportive wife was waiting quietly on the front porch, having watched the entire grueling hearing broadcast live on television. She didn't rush out to meet him. When he parked, she simply opened the screen door and waited. He carried his father's cherished photograph carefully back inside the house. For 24 years, that specific photograph had rested faithfully on his personal nightstand, and he quietly returned it to its rightful place. Resting prominently above the mantelpiece in their living room was a yellowing clipping from the New York Post dated April 12, 2019. The blazing headline read, "Representative Ilhan Omar 9/11 was, some people did something." Underneath, a smaller, defiant caption read, "Here's your something," followed by an agonizing list of the names of the dead. At exactly 5:48 that evening, Nicholas Harros Jr. finally took that painful clipping down from the wall. He had waited 6 long, incredibly bitter years for the opportunity to remove it. He folded the fragile paper just once and tucked it away safely inside his desk drawer, refusing to throw it away, but no longer needing to look at it every single day. Hundreds of miles away in Minneapolis, Mohammed Farah woke early and unlocked the front doors of his small grocery store on Lake Street at 6:00 the next morning, exactly as he had faithfully done every single morning for 16 years. However, this morning was entirely different. There was an unexpectedly massive line of people waiting patiently outside on the sidewalk. The crowd was diverse. Some individuals were Somali and many others were not. They hadn't come early to purchase milk or bread. They were standing in that long line for the sole purpose of shaking the grieving grandfather's hand. The extraordinary line stretched down the block and remained steady until 10 inches the morning. While Mohammed Farah actually sold significantly fewer groceries that morning than he usually did, he absolutely refused to close the store early. He made a point to personally and warmly greet every single person who had waited in that line throughout the entire morning. He never once had to explicitly mention his beloved grandson by name. The community already knew exactly why they were there, so he didn't have to say a word. Over in Yorktown Heights, New York, Sarah Goldstein drove back to her quiet home that evening. After testifying at exactly 8:09, her phone rang. It was her daughter calling all the way from her new safe school down in Florida. The mother and daughter stayed on the line talking deeply for 2 hours and 4 minutes. Her traumatized daughter wept uncontrollably for the first 45 minutes of the call, while Sarah remained incredibly strong, refusing to cry and simply listening to her child's pain. Eventually, her daughter's tears subsided enough for her to say, "Mom, you said my name on TV." Sarah simply replied, "Yes, I did." After a moment, her daughter finally gathered the courage to say the words she had been holding on to, "I want to come home." Filled with immense relief, Sarah softly replied, "I know, come home." Back in Washington, Ilhan Omar eventually walked out of the Capitol building at 12:14 inches the afternoon. Noticeably, she did not have a single protective staffer walking by her side. Her fiercely protective communications director was nowhere to be seen. A relentless swarm of cameras eagerly followed her lonely descent down the grand marble steps. But she stubbornly refused to acknowledge or respond to a single question shouted her way. A sleek black SUV was waiting silently for her at the curb on First Street. She climbed into the quiet isolation of the back seat. The driver, a reliable contractor she had utilized for 3 years, genuinely did not know where he was supposed to take her, because she never uttered a single word of instruction. The massive SUV aimlessly circled the immediate vicinity of the Capitol complex for 20 full minutes. Finally breaking the uncomfortable silence, the confused driver politely asked Congresswoman, "Where would you like to go?" She still did not answer. On that unforgettable Wednesday morning in late February, inside a historic Rayburn hearing room, the entire country had powerfully remembered 3 distinct names. They remembered Frank Harros, they remembered little Yusef Farah, and they remembered Beth Minette's brave 1-year-old son, who was a strong one, 7-year-old young man now. The powerful congresswoman from Minneapolis had stubbornly refused to say a single one of them.